talk about behavior rating scales for a second. I'm going to start off with just a definition, a brief overview. You guys got I'm sure the concept, and this is, tools that require somebody to go through a series of questions on a child with some particular scaling structure, and then we're going to compare those answers to some norm population. So right off on the bat, we're playing an old school psychometric game. We're taking a behavioral normalcy statement, or more precise, kind of what do people typically say about children, and how does this individual statement about a target child compare to what people typically say about children? And I like to think that the norm groups are kind of focusing on this fictitious child in Kansas, or this fictitious group of typical children, as if behavior is in a nice bell curve presentation. Right? We're asking them to do this on past observation. Does anybody specify to the teacher exactly what the range of observation should be?
Like the time range?
Right. So he say, I want you just to think about this for the last month, or I want you to just think about this for the last 2 months. That's actually a more savvy use. I think most people drop these off and maybe put a note. Yeah, that's actually a pretty savvy use of them. Does anybody withhold? Well, you all will say yes because you have to, but you're supposed to withhold. You can't give a BESS or a BASC to a teacher in the first 2 weeks or week of school for logical reasons. They haven't had enough data to sample. We haven't had a ton of discussion about the difference between 3 weeks of exposure, 7 weeks of exposure, 9 weeks of exposure, a year of exposure. Obviously, that has a pretty big deal. I mean, you're building up your memories of this child. And we do say, think about X unit of time, but it's pretty hard to distinguish a month or 2 months. We've actually got some really good data suggesting that teachers can't remember yesterday in most instances, much less what happened a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Some examples, and you guys have seen them all: BASC2, the CBCL, the Connors, the SSIS. Pardon?
In a high school, they might see 180 kids a day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And they have to grade them the best they can.
Yeah, no, you're right. And when we do a lot of our research, we actually have a couple studies in high schools. Now we go up to middle school. But even at the middle school level, the teacher's exposures to kid is so different than it is at the fourth and fifth is a weird grade actually, because fifth, the whole construct of the way teachers think about kids seems to shift halfway through fifth grade, and it seems to be that you get a very different perception of kids. I just mean in the ratings. Oh, yeah, and all of a sudden, different things become quite important. But you're right; it's a totally different view when you get up to the high school and in the individual exposures. When I started this research line in the late 90s. Anybody remember what in late 90s BASC, how many items there were? It was the 88-item BASC, right? And I mean, we wrote article after article about it's preposterous to ask people to answer 88 items. If I would have only known that we could get some of these up to $1.44, I mean, it has expanded dramatically. And we've actually got some incredibly interesting research suggesting that of those 144 items, there are really about 15 or 20 that are the core items. And load, we've got some real basic 12-item screeners that correlate with the full, the full SSIS, at 0.95. I mean, shocking correlations. Tons of these questions are really not incredibly useful questions. But regardless, these are, pardon? Has eye problem, right? That would be a good ones. Oh, a number of the ones that teachers don't like to fill out because they're like the ones who are actually reading it and saying, well, how would I know if the kid, right? I don't know, exactly, drug use or something of that nature. So the scopes of these scales, and this was an interesting thing that we wrote about. Very rarely do people kind of highlight the difference between narrowband targeted scales and comprehensive scales. And we give comprehensive scales to a ton of kids when we really are asking for narrow band ratings. And so, for example, in most instances, like an LD case, I don't really care about most of the BESS. I want to know if the kid seems to be attentive and not hyperactive in that environment. Some of the ADHD narrowband scales give us pretty decent estimates of the amount of time the kid is attending to academic activities within those particular environments. These general purpose scales often have some of these narrow band scales based in them and that you can pull out. But we often drop these large scale ones on teachers all the time just so we can get that extra information. It's interesting because on the behavior side, that's kind of considered okay, right? On the academic or intellectual side, that would be called fishing. So we're not allowed just to give a bunch of extra measures that we have no purpose to give because if we just look at probability, we're going to find some cases of where something's going to pop. And if you had no a priori reason to suspect that the kid was schizophrenic, and the teacher endorses a couple of items, maybe because they're not reading that the kid's got some odd tendencies, that doesn't parallel the same as when you actually had a preconceived idea. The narrowband ideas, for example, the Brown ADHD scales or some of the stuff what we're seeing like the BESS ADHD monitor, etc., end up being tighter focused. When we say narrow scales, how big are these still?
30 items.
Pardon?
You mean how many items?
Yeah, how many items?
30.
Yeah, 40, 30. Like the BESS ends up down to 25. Pardon?
CBI, like the teacher version.
Pardon?
The CBI, the teacher version, and the CBI is pretty short.
How short does that get down to?
The teacher version is 8, and teacher and parent are like 8, and then student is about 24.
Yeah, we'll get down to, when we start getting to 8 items, 6 items, 7, no, well, we assume psychometric properties, and we need to talk about the psychometric development of rating scales. It's very important. But there's actually a lot of momentum around super short rating scales, and they're a hell of a lot more accurate than anybody would have expected. I mean, behavior rating scales never went down the Gomes pathway. So within the academic game and within the intellect game, we believe that there are these large constructs that have broad importance. Oral reading fluency, the great academic example. It's not that oral reading fluency is everything. It's that if you don't have oral reading fluency, you're toast. And so you know this is an important thing to hit. On the behavior side, we're resistant to this idea that there might be some targeted questions that have general outcome measure utility. So essentially, if the teacher thinks that the kid's respectful, and this is what we're going to get down to DBRs, if the teacher thinks the kid is not disruptive, and if the teacher thinks the kid seems to be kind of engaged, then are they a social behavior problem anymore? And how many questions do we actually need to get a reliable estimate of that? And there's some research out of Northeastern suggesting it's only 3 or 4 given a couple of times. Okay, now it's not given once, it's given in a couple of events. But we can shorten this dramatically and get some tight scales. A lot of these still, because of the way they validate them, go back to 40 items or 30 items, and that's more of a validation issue than it is an actual utility issue. These are profile scores. You've seen them, whatever. I mean, you've seen this stuff way too long. All right, so these scales, the broadband scales, are incredibly good. Well, what is the BASC designed to tell us?
You need to investigate something further.
Yeah, kind of. I think that's a savvy interpretation of it. I don't know that they would argue that it's just a screener. I think I would probably be comfortable with that. But
know that I would ever feel like it was enough to diagnose on.
Well, the way the BEST is designed is it's designed to have wickedly high retest reliability. And so, or the BASC, sorry. The BEST is not designed to have, well, it kind of is. But so the BASC, if you give the BASC to a teacher on Tuesday, and they say the kid is inattentive, there is not much reason to go back and give them another one a week from now. They have a ton of research to say that the teacher is probably going to say the same thing. And the teacher is going to be very angry that you've asked them to do this, a second time. Okay? So it's based on the idea of defining within an individual rater some sort of disability or some sort of problem area that is going to be consistent observation to observation. Okay? Now this is the exact same as an achievement test. If I give an achievement test to a kid today and he gets a 92 in some area, and there's no use of giving it to him again a week from now because it should be within X range if it was given correctly. Now I know sometimes it's not, but regardless, we wouldn't give it to them a second time. Okay? So these have been built, the entire way they're developed, the entire way they're normed and validated, and a lot of this has to do with utilizing of a norm structure and utilizing scale scores, etc. A lot of the same issues that we had on the academic side pre-CBM. But they are built to be test-retest reliable. To be test-retest reliable, you have to have a lot of items because I'm going to give it once and I'm going to give it again another time. Okay? I don't have the opportunity to give a small number of items time again, and then look at the validity across the length of the items. So they're built specifically to be consistent from observation A to observation B. So using that as the idea, what's the issue with progress monitoring with any sort of rating scale which has been validated in a traditional manner? it's built, I mean, and ironically, and I would love, Randy is, well, okay, it's built to be non-responsive to intervention. Right? It is literally built to minimize any change that occurs from environment A to environment B. Items which had low test retest reliability have been removed. Ironically, the exact items that we now use in some of our measures would have been items that you would have removed from the previous measure because they weren't consistent after a week or after 2 weeks. Does that make sense? Now, this is not an attack on rating scales, because if you want a generalizable yearly statement about a child, it's the perfect tool. Okay? It's built, this is what the teacher thinks generally about a kid. Kid's hyperactive. This is data that schools want to have. This is a conversation they want to have. When I give them my data and say nuance, well, if we look at this, it's not really this, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear hyperactive. Okay? But this is not built in a way that statistically is ever going to be effective at actually looking at a stream of change over a period of time. Now, that's the 144 item scale. If you're in this game, though, if you're in the rating scale game, we got to find a way to put this in AIMSweb, because AIMSweb makes cash. I mean, AIMSweb, it's just like, I mean, literally, you're just talking about, if you could just get 3% of that for the rest of your life, you can quit. This is a good deal. So we got to find a way to do a behavior version of this, because this, you know, I go back to those slides at the beginning. And if you're in the rating scale game, or if you're Randy, if you're Kamphaus, and you have made tons of cash on the rating scale game, you don't think, you know what I should do? I should throw this all away. And I should adapt an entirely new model of not only how to build an assessment method, right, but of an entirely new class of social behavior assessment. You say, well, let's do 20 items. If the issue is feasibility, let's do 20 items. And if you go through the BESS manual, and you've got one of them in your little things over there in the deals, you'll see study after study after study, and it shows that the BESS is a reliable and valid instrument. And it has done this by showing what data? How do we know the BESS works? Because it correlates with the BASC, and because it has test-retest reliability. Right? So and again, if that's what you do as a researcher, if that's what you do, then you do that. It's like asking a behaviorist to look at cognitive therapy. It's a bad match in research ideology. It doesn't make any sense. Okay? And so we go down to 20 items or 22 items. It's not just a feasibility issue. It's not just getting teachers to fill these out 45 times. It's also designing it in a method and validating it in a method which makes sense to see response to change. Okay? In terms of screening, on the other hand, that's a standard psychometric question, and that is just a feasibility question. And so what we measure in a study we're going to talk about more to the end here, we actually compare our DBRs to the BESS, because the BESS is a pretty good screening instrument. We would argue that our instruments become superior because they take less time and they give us baseline data. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that if teachers are willing to spend, 45, 50, an hour filling out BESSes on every kid, it's not a bad screening method whatsoever, because again, it's supposed to tell you at-risk ratings at that particular period of time. That's the BESS. If we're looking at a short rating scale, I believe this is the most studied. In terms of anybody who's trying to create something different than the BESS, we all compare our stuff to the BESS in terms of screening tools. And so I think that should say something about the respect for this particular instrument in terms of how it's been developed as a tool. It's not a progress monitoring tool, but as a screening tool, has some pretty nice pieces. Anybody ever use the SSIS screening universal monitoring? That's interesting. This is a pretty sweet scale. You just put the kids' names down this side, and then you rate them on math, reading, motivation, and there's a couple other ones. I can't think of them at the time. And obviously, a 1 is bad. 2 or 3 is good. Is in the at-risk range. 4 is good. A 5 is fantastic. This scale is interesting. It has an overestimation rate for screening purposes. It'll tell you about 40% of kids in a class are at risk, and so that's a problem. Ironically, if you move to a 3.5 as your cutoff score, a 3.5 over large groups ends up being a pretty nice tool. They don't have a mechanism for doing half points, and we're going to talk a little bit about scaling issues, but it turns out that on many of these instruments, it's the original scaling that's the problem. You need about 7 or 8 gradients for people to really measure behavioral change. And with 5 gradients, you get people putting kids into boxes that just are, they don't really fit what teachers think about those boxes. But it's a nice tool to look at. This is the BASC monitor. This is a 47-item scale with the idea that we're going to give it repeatedly. This is not new, but it is not researched heavily. The BASC monitor has never had a large-scale, awful lot of research that has been backing it. I would argue that the ADHD-4 Dupal's measure is a much more responsive, it's a 12-item deal, but is a much more validated version for ADHD kids. But even back in 1998, they were starting to get at the idea that we've got to find a way to track these kids out. You know, we've got to look at these over time. These measures haven't proven to be the most useful, but it's an approach which I think they kind of get excited about. This is a question: how, if we're going to give a rating scale over and over again, how short does it need to be? It's just an open question. What we know is that Ames Webb, with the 22-item BESS, has blown up.
But you can customize the progress monitor.
You can, but you still, I mean, you still have to give it in its initial stages. Even shortening it down, that's, at least in the schools that have attempted it that I've dealt with, they've experienced some real frustration. And that even gets down to some shorter numbers. I don't know if 10 repeatedly is going to work.
Thinking about that presentation on that virus that we went through, I think they said something like 5 or something like that.
The flex was the 5.
Yeah, I think 5 is getting to the point of where you might have some buy-in. We honestly, on our DBRs, ask teachers to fill out 3 and have some real frustration. Teachers want to not do all 3. They want to do one item. I know it sounds silly, but in my experiences, you guys all learned that face validity doesn't matter? That face validity is not all that incredibly important? Okay. In my personal experience, face validity doesn't matter unless you don't have it. And if you don't have it, face validity becomes wickedly, wickedly important. I think feasibility is kind of like that. For some reason, if teachers decide that's too much, you're done, you're toast. And we've had difficulty even upwards of 3 items. I think 3, 5, 6 is probably the number that we can do. It needs to be quick. I think it needs to be cheap. I don't think we can ask people to buy forms every single time they're going to fill these out. It's going to have to be a cheap approach.
How long does it take them to fill out your 3 items?
It takes them more time to open it than to fill it out. And I don't think adding the extra items on. Their point, and this is not a bad point, is engagement's not a problem. Why am I filling out that item? And it's really not a stupid point. It's more of a, I don't want to do something I don't need to do, even if it doesn't really take extra time. There's also the argument to be made that if you're asking them to fill out engagement and disruptive behavior and respectful, that asking them to focus on engagement might detract from their capacity to measure those other ones. Again, I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's an interesting question. I think it's a huge part of this game. Finding out feasibly what teachers will do. And when I say over and over again, I don't mean once a week. There's no reason to rate once a week on these kids. You don't remember what happened on Monday or Tuesday with formative ratings. I mean daily. Again, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think we have an answer to what the length is. What's interesting is none of us are talking. I think 10, honestly, is at least one number too high. I think when you go double digits, I think for some reason that has an issue. I think it's going to have to be 9, 8, 7, 6. And I think ideally we need to get this down for most of the cases very low. Now, if you give me a severely autistic child, although there's going to be some arguments that multiple items in those cases is going to be more problematic.